Welcome to Syntax. In this Friday Supper Club, we're going to be talking to Kevin Hou of Codeium, and we're going to be talking all about AI superpowers in your code base, in your text editor, all of the cool type of new tools that have arrived on our doorstep, and just in general, how we can get the most out of these tools and a little bit about how they work. So, Kevin, how is it going? Do you want to maybe give a quick introduction to who you are and what you do and how you ended up at Codeium?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Scott, Wes. Big
welcome.
fan of the podcast, so it's cool to be featured. Like Scott said, my name's Kevin. I am from the Bay Area, been a builder all my life, engineer, born and raised. I've kind of been in the startup world, or was exposed to the startup world very on. Got my computer science degree, and naturally, like any other Bay Area native, kind of returned back to my roots. And I actually started my career in the self-driving car industry. So I was working at a company called Neuro. Yeah, we were doing package delivery. So kind of not quite sidewalk robots, but small smart car-ish sized robots. And there I was building developer tools. So, you might think with AV, a lot of it comes down to kind of the decision making, the car's intelligence, all that sort of thing. But what I found very interesting was the tooling and the visualization specifically that went into how do we make this car drive. And so I was spending a lot of time thinking about just kind of what autonomy engineers wanted, how to understand what the car was thinking and why it was making the decisions it was making. So always been in this sort of like tooling, product, user experience world, specifically related to AI. So Codeium has been around for a little over a year now. When the Codeium product first got started, Varun Mohan, who's the CEO and co-founder, we had worked together in the past, and he approached me with this kind of new idea of getting LLMs into IDEs, getting LLMs into the developer experience. And as someone who was really interested in building tools, I thought it was a great opportunity. So I've been here since its inception, a little over a year ago.
Wow. And so this comes out of Exa Function. Is that the company that owns Codeium? Is that accurate? Or
Yeah. It's a bit of it's an interesting story. Basically, Exa Function was the original startup. So about 2 years ago, Exa Function got started doing ML inference workloads. So the whole idea was, how do we maximize and squeeze the most amount of compute out of GPUs? So there's a variety of techniques. Happy to talk about those later down the road. But you can think of it as GPUs are expensive. How do we get the best bang for our buck? And so we were building infrastructure to kind of orchestrate these large scale workloads. Think of, again, a lot of us have backgrounds in self-driving. Think about the workload of an autonomous vehicle. You have limited compute, limited dollars. You got to detect where objects are, where collisions could occur, all that sort of thing. And so Exa Function was managing, tens of thousands of GPUs to basically make that inference as quick as possible. Now, a year later, I think when the LLM boom kicked off, we realized, developer tools, AI, similar workload patterns. A lot of these LLMs are very, very computationally heavy. And the best way that we could deliver a product to people is by using our own infrastructure that we had built at Exa Function to serve a product. And that sort of infrastructure layer is still kind of the bedrock of our product, which makes us, able to give you the best possible experience, the lowest latency, and deliver that product for free for our individual users.
That's really cool. It's like, I've heard that there's this thing going around. People say like Microsoft is losing money on GitHub Copilot. I don't know if that's true or not, but like maybe you can confirm it is very expensive to run something like a GitHub Copilot.
Totally. I mean, the amount of compute needed for these sorts of language models is immense. I can't fact check exactly the Copilot numbers. Funnily enough, when that announcement came out, I was actually at the AI Engineers Summit in San Francisco, and one of the Copilot reps was on stage as that tweet was kind of circulating, and he had to, do a bit of damage control. But I think ultimately what that indicates, is it is expensive. And I think even for a company that has relations like that to Microsoft and OpenAI and that whole kind of trifecta, it's an incredibly expensive product to put out there. In my opinion, the $20 that you pay for Copilot is actually a deal, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Interesting.
But what we've tried to do is we want to give this to everyone. We want to democratize this product. I'm assuming you've used Copilot and you've used sort of these autocomplete tools. Once you go, it's magic. You can't go back. And so we want to deliver that experience to as many people as possible. Exafunction was the perfect infrastructure play to make that happen.
Wow. So, okay, I guess that's a good introduction then to maybe even move it into Codeium itself, which works in your IDE. It has 561,000 installs on VS Code, 262,000 installs in JetBrains. So those are some wild numbers. But can you tell me, I guess, what exactly makes Codeium different than other, language assistants inside of your code base? I feel like I've used a whole ton of these different ones. So what sets Codeium apart here?
Sure. I think there's three things. So first of which, autocomplete. That's kind of your classic, as you're typing, we try to predict what you're thinking, lowest latency, user in the loop sort of workflow. We offer the fastest, hence the infrastructure, the fastest product on the market for that sort of thing, which means every single keystroke, we're trying our best to figure out what you need. Number two, we have a chat assistant, and this chat assistant is actually codebase aware. And I think that's something that really sets us apart from, I guess, the competition or other products on the market. We can infer based on, what your actions are, what your most recent edits are, things of that nature to deliver very relevant results to you. And then finally, I think I kind of allude to this, but personalization in general is something that we take a lot of pride in at Codeium. That includes things like knowing what repos that you're using, knowing what external third-party libraries you're using, documentation internal to perhaps either your organization or your individual projects, and being able to kind of assemble all this and then run the generations on top of that, make the experience not just a, what would any developer do? It's like, okay, no, this is what Kevin Hou would want to write, given that he is working on, Kevin Hou personal website using X libraries.
Yeah, that's one thing that we keep coming back to in AI is that context is king, in that the more information you can give it about what you're doing, the better the actual result is. And obviously there's a limit to how much context you can feed something before you have to go ahead and train your own model. And that's why these coding assistants are likely better than just copy pasting that into a chat, because it doesn't necessarily know. And we had I don't want to keep bringing in Copilot because I understand, but we had them on and they weren't able to tell me this. So I'm going to ask you, and you might say I'm not allowed to tell you either, but what are you sending to the AI to get such good completions? Because sometimes I delete something, sometimes it knows my tabs. They were able to tell us it knows what tabs you have open, but it's got to know more than that. Are you able to spill the beans on what you're sending to the AI?
Okay, I can leak all this with the preface that, of course, we don't train on anyone's data. We are very secure. We actually have 0-day retention, so you can take my word for it, however much that means to you, that as soon as it hits our stuff, goes through our models, and it'll leave quite promptly afterwards. There are a number of things that you can do to get hyper advanced context. And I think Copilot, having used the product and talked to some of their reps, is unfortunately just has not cracked, I think, the full spectrum of things that you could do. So for example, you mentioned neighboring files and kind of what tabs you have open, or I guess you mentioned what tabs you have open. That's just one of the things that you can do to say, okay, they're looking at this particular folder. Our service runs what's called a language server. A language server is this binary that sits behind the IDE. So unlike a lot of the other products on the market, we are IDE agnostic. That's first and foremost. So whether or not you're using Vim or Emacs or VS Code or JetBrains, you're going to have a very similar experience, because a lot of our logic is inside of this language server binary that's shippable across any operating system. Now, that language server binary is responsible for sort of orchestrating indexing workloads, crawling, anything that it might deem relevant to what you're doing. So, for example, you boot up VS Code, you're in a particular project. If you have this setting enabled, we'll actually go through and run sort of an embedding store on what's inside of your code base, which means every single file will get indexed, every single function will get indexed, whatever your documentation, all that sort of thing. And this all happens locally using an embedding store. Now we also have other sources such as active tabs, where you last edited. You can even look at things like Git commit history, which is quite interesting to see what sorts of things you're most recently doing. You can imagine in the future, and we haven't gotten to this yet, but you can imagine in the future you have a GitHub issue or you have a Jira ticket. Now suddenly you have kind of this high level intent of what you are trying to do as a developer. That can dictate where you look as well. And so every time you invoke, let's just say an autocomplete, it'll run through all these different sources and pull in what it deems relevant. We re-rank everything to try and fit it within that kind of valuable context window. Then at that point, we send that over to our model. The model generates something, sends it back to the language server, and then we deliver it to the IDE surface in the form of an autocomplete, a chat message, whatever that surface may be.
That's super interesting. I was always so curious about that. I was like, oh, maybe they like look in the clipboard and see what's in your clipboard, but it's obviously a lot more than that. Like like I assume with JavaScript you could probably crawl the dependency tree, right, and see how files interact with each other.
You're spot on there. And I think one of the first things that we did was looking at imports. So being able to, we do this thing, it's called an abstract syntax tree. So an abstract syntax, man, say that 3 times fast. What an AST is, you can break your files and your programs into like a graph, a sequence of nodes that have some sort of semantic meaning. And in this case, we cared about imports. So now across all the different languages, we're looking and analyzing what are you importing in this particular file that you're working on. Because we can then say, if it's a local file, let's actually open up that file. Let's summarize that file and then use that as context. Or if it's an external file, we actually rolled out a service, it's called Codeium Live, but it allows you to actually look at the public open source library source code that's living either on GitHub or on Bitbucket, use that to inform the model, okay, here's what they're actually trying to import. So you're suddenly kind of combining all these different external sources and internal sources to then give you the best completions.
That's cool. And how big of a code base can you run this on? So I think like somebody listening right now said, all right, we have, I don't know, 20,000 files. Like I think Vercel the other day said they have something like 40,000 JSX components or something like that. Like could you crawl that much? Or there's obviously a limit to how much you can embed, right?
Embedding is quite cheap from a computational and literally a cost perspective. So relative to the LLM workflow, that hasn't been a constraint so far. And you actually allude to kind of an interesting point of scale, right? And again, this is, I think, where our exafunction background and a lot of our ML infrastructure comes into play here. So we currently are processing on the order of, I think, tens of billions of tokens a day, somewhere along that range of just sheer amount of code that we are trying to either index or generate on. And so for this example, if you have 20,000 files, the embedding part is actually is okay. There is actually no constraint there. We haven't hit a constraint. And to give you a sense, one of our marquee customers is Dell. Massive company, massive repositories, years and years of source code. And they so far have been quite happy with this setup, and we haven't had any issues with scaling. And I think what this comes down to is having very intelligent kind of re-ranking, you could call it. Even if you have 50 different button components, let's say if you're Vercel, you have 50 different files named button.tsx, and you're working on a project. Because of the re-ranking context that we talked about with, okay, what project are you working on? What repo are you in? We can very quickly filter down into what we believe is most relevant. So I guess in that case, it becomes a bit easier. You can say, okay, you're importing, let's just say you're importing from Vercel/design system. There's probably only one button in the Vercel design system, and so it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay, so to give the audience another example of the embedding, because I'm always the guy that talks about embeddings whenever AI comes up, is like with the syntax transcripts, we converted every single sentence that we said, each of them to an embedding, and then you search for something like rice maker, and they will find every time we've ever mentioned rice maker, and then we grab the 3 sentences before, 3 sentences after, and then maybe we'll take the top 3 of those and send it along. So you're, instead of sending around transcripts, you have some sort of algorithm that figures out what are the best pieces that we need to send along as context. You're not sending the entire code base along for the completion.
No, and I think that's a key differentiation. I mean, the prompts are big, but on the scale of code bases, they are tiny, and so you really have to be selective about what you're sending.
And that's that's what makes it good, right? That's the secret sauce of figuring out. I recently dipped into algorithms. I'm a data scientist now. I'm not, but
Nice.
I was like, K-means, and now I'm like reading papers about what K-means is. I'm way out of my league.
It's fascinating stuff.
We have an episode title on the calendar that says, "Whoops, I'm a data scientist." I have a question about preferences within your code base. Does it pick up on things like code styling? Like, for instance, I write JavaScript in snake case. Will it preserve my snake case when I ask it for questions?
I might have to hard code that if your name's Scott and you're using snake case variable names in JavaScript, that they are not allowed to use the product. But but yes, to answer your question, it will look at what you already have written and use that to dictate what it does. And I think
so code styling is picked up on that. Yeah.
Code styling is picked up. And I think on a case like snake casing, that is a fairly easy thing to pick up on, just simply by the file that you're in probably has existing snake case variables. And so it'll kind of do its thing there. Where this gets a little bit more interesting is when, let's just say you're using a specific version of a unit testing suite or a specific version of a language. Maybe you're using Node or Node 20 instead of Node 18, right? And there's certain things that are unavailable. This is, I think, when deep context really comes into play, and that's where we're actually inferring kind of these higher level things about your code base without you explicitly telling us. And so that means being able to answer the question, are they using Jest? What version of Jest, and what's that testing infrastructure look like? So then I can go and actually generate the relevant unit tests in the way that is runnable in their code base.
That's something that's always been a problem with any of these tools. Like, for instance, right now, I'm using Svelte 5. It's in pre-release candidate. So you're saying that Codeium will actually look at that dependency and then scan the dependency itself to understand Svelte 5 code, or is that the case? So I could actually use this with the latest versions of whatever I'm using instead of just being SOL.
Yeah. So I want to say yes, but I want to say yes with we are working on all the different surfaces that can make this possible. So one of the features that we're rolling out very soon is the ability to pin a piece of quote context. So I guess in your case, Scott, you'll be working on your project. You'll have a sidebar up. We call it Codeium Brain. It's the ability to kind of do these, I guess, more advanced tweakings. And you'll actually go in and press the add context bit, and you'll say, I want Svelte of this version. And I guess in your case, since it's pre-release, you'll probably do Svelte at this commit on GitHub. And then for all future generations across all the different surfaces, and as a reminder, we have autocomplete as a surface, we have chat as a surface, and we also actually have terminal as a surface. All these different services will now have Svelte of that commit as kind of a prior, and as it's going through, it'll weight that with higher importance, so that then in theory your generations will be relevant to your use case.
Okay. And that's actually a really interesting segue for a question I had too. You mentioned having those different interfaces for interacting with the AI. I've always wondered a little bit personally, have we hit the best UI, not aesthetically, but for working with AI? And is that chat, is that inline, is that comments? What's your take on how we interact with AI as developers?
I think the autocomplete surface is brilliant so far. I think so far it has been the most intuitive way to work with an LLM that we've seen across all sorts of industries. I think GPT, sort of that chat interface, is great, but I think the first success that we saw was GitHub Copilot's ability to put this in the IDE. So I still think that the autocomplete product, that form is well understood and fairly easy or intuitive to pick up. On the higher level, multi-step reasoning, more and more complicated changes surface, I think there's a lot of work to be done and honestly a lot of exploration to be done. I think it's really hard to break these sorts of workflows. Imagine you're creating a PR, for example. I mean, that's kind of the holy grail of what a lot of us AGI companies are kind of going for. It's like, how do we go from a GitHub issue to a PR and have that get merged and tested and all that sort of thing? The amount of steps that have to go into that process is variable and immense. There might be multiple iterations. There might be multiple stages of testing. It might start PR reviewing itself. So you don't really, there's no limit on the amount of complexity that can kind of go into something like that. And I think from a user experience standpoint, I don't believe that chat is going to be the end result of a product like that, just simply because it abstracts away a lot of the complexity that I think you need to understand in order for the workflow to work. You have to be able to go in and sort of manually tweak. What if it did step 3 out of 20 wrong? Now steps 4 through 20 are now corrupt. How do we go back and make that change? That doesn't feel exactly like a chat-based workflow. So I think we have a bit of searching to do. But I think the nice part is there's plenty of companies working on this sort of thing. So I think someone will kind of arrive on a logical user experience.
What's the Silicon Valley, you go to a party and everyone had a couple beers and there's that one guy in the corner that goes, all right, hear me out. Have you heard, throw the text editor out the window, throw the laptop out the window. Is there any wild ideas that you've heard?
I mean, people have all sorts of ideas. I think from a coding perspective, I actually saw a really interesting, I think it was called Coffee, I want to say. It was one of these, it was literally an NPM library that you would install, and you're writing in, I believe it was React. And in the interface that you would use to chat with an LLM was literally opening a markdown component and writing what you wanted in that markdown component, and then it would update its own source code.
Oh my gosh.
Crazy idea. I personally don't know if that's the kind of ergonomics that I would want, but you know, people are thinking of everything. I think voice had a moment there, where people are like, I just want to dictate what I'm doing. But I think what people have realized is, so far, you really do need the human in the loop for the sorts of performance that we're talking about currently. I mean, GPT-4 and all these language models are really great, but they are still prone for errors. And especially when we're talking on the magnitude of replacing developers, it's got to be perfect. It's got to build that trust, and you've got to be very quick with kind of course correction. And so far, that sort of autocomplete form factor is the way that you can best course correct.
And developers rejoice because we have not been replaced. We have to hit tab.
So far, we have a funny thing in the office. We actually have a foot pedal that we've programmed to tab, so you can just just tap to completion.
I would love that. I love non-standard interfaces like that.
That's what the voice thing was really interesting to me as well. It's we have a keyboard and you have a mouse, but what other inputs can you have when you're working with coding? So foot pedal, voice.
Spatial computing, you're going to be waving.
Spatial. That's true.
Get out of here. Come back.
All right. I have a question here. So you sit down at your desk. How do you make an AI model? Everyone's always talking, you build an AI model, but what is that? What is an AI model? How do you make one of those? Oh, he takes a drink.
I know.
Here we
go. Raise some money.
Okay.
Yep.
Get the checkbooks ready. It's a very complicated and often non-linear process for this sort of thing. So I think there's a few components, and actually on your podcast on kind of the AI primitives that you were talking about, you nailed a lot of the points. So I won't dive into too much detail on sort of those technical nuances, but at the end of the day, you need You need some goal. What are you
Yep.
trying to achieve? You need data that can make that achievement possible.
Mhm.
And then you need a lot of compute. I mean, essentially, in a nutshell, these LLMs are trying their best to predict based on a sequence of tokens, like what is the next most probable token. That, in a nutshell, is like basic ingredients of what you need for the model itself. Now, what we've noticed is when building a product like Codeium, that is only the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, the model is incredibly important, and the performance there and the number of parameters, all these things scale with the product quality. But then you also think about all the different infrastructure that goes behind that sort of thing. So we mentioned the language server binary, being able to compile local files and figure out context and do the prompt construction. That's a meaty part of what makes this product experience magical. You've got the IDE surface where you were like, okay, we need to be able to interface with said language model or said language server. You've got the infrastructure to support the actual inference on the model. So for example, you could do the naive thing of running a single model on a single machine and just taking requests in serial, right? But when you're serving hundreds of thousands of users like Codeium is, it's very important that you can have parallelization, model quantization, being able to compress and make the actual inference as efficient as possible. One of the very first things that we did for the Codeium product is actually implement cancellations as a first class functionality. The reason why that's important is GPU time, like we've discussed, is incredibly valuable. And cancellations, because of the autocomplete form factor, as soon as you type, if you're typing it faster than our latency, let's just say our latency is 10 milliseconds. If you're typing it faster than 10 milliseconds, the previous request is probably irrelevant. You probably won't see 99% of the completions that come through. And so what we're doing from the very beginning is, because we kind of own this product to infrastructure to model layer, we can implement a way for the model to kick out, save that GPU time so that 99% of the requests can get canceled midway through. You now have slots for 99 other people to use the same GPU. I mean, the math doesn't quite work exactly like that, but the general idea of like what it takes to build Codeium as a product, there's so many different facets. And I think what our team is very excited by is just solving a lot of really hard like infrastructure problems. It is not always, I think research has a play. Research is immensely important for LLM products, but there are some brilliant people at brilliant companies working on those sorts of things. And what we have decided is we are product first. How do we make something very, very useful? Whatever the research can spit out, we can inherit and benefit from. But the very basic thing, we want to build a product that is rigorous and useful. And we start from those primitives, and we kind of do the work there. We do the hard engineering work to make that possible. And then we'll worry about, what is the 10-year horizon look like for LLMs.
Interesting. I never even thought about that, but it's true. Like we talked about the embeddings and all the experience of all that. That stuff matters a lot. For the user experience as well as, I'm sure, like if you can save 10% of your compute costs, I'm sure that is very significant.
It's huge.
What languages? Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say, like, how many of these ideas that make its way into Codeium? I mean, as developers, I'm sure these things just pop into your head. Is it like when you're developing tools like this? Is it, hey, I came up with this thing I would really like to do. Let's see if we can hack it together. Or is it based on community knowledge or listening to what users want? Like, how are you all coming up with the ideas for these types of developer tools?
A few things here. We have a very active Discord, and I think people are pretty quick and eager to share what they believe is the next logical feature, or, and you can kind of do your own compilation of like what that means. You hear 10 requests, you try and figure out what that feature could look like. What's been interesting is we're catering to kind of an individual audience and then simultaneously an enterprise audience. And of course, as you know, when people start paying for you, their opinions matter a lot more. Yeah. And so we're kind of at this point where we're receiving a lot of requests that might benefit kind of an organization level, like some of the things that we were describing with massive number of files, for example, hundreds of thousands of files. Those sorts of features are probably only going to benefit the enterprise rather than the consumers. And so I guess the way that we tried to reconcile these two is we kind of try to boil this down into where is the use case for like an enterprise developer, and then we kind of use the individual tier as a way to validate these sorts of products. So the individuals are actually getting basically the forefront of like our quote research, or like what the features that we believe are going to be the next frontier, and then we slowly validate those things and then push them over to the enterprise. I guess not a very clean way of answering your question, but like we have many different streams coming in, and we do our best to try and find something that works for everyone, but at the scale of what is enabled for an enterprise, if that makes sense. We could do many features that are, I don't want to say gimmicky, because I think that's probably an unfair term, because they're probably very cool and they could be useful, right? But if we went after every single idea that came into our heads, we'd move at a very quick rate of shipping. But I don't think that a lot of those would end up making it to the enterprise, either because they're not useful or because they don't scale well, or any number of reasons. In embedding, for an example, if we did that the incorrect way of maybe file grepping and didn't put it in some sort of scalable infrastructure, that product would never have made it to the enterprise because it just doesn't support that level of scale. And so we're very meticulous about deciding what we work on such that it can eventually make it to the scale that hopefully, Codeium can be.
That's a fine line to walk with enterprise versus, your free customers they're not paying. They are free customers who are essentially freeloading, but it's important for everybody to get to try the tools to experience them in the same regard. So yeah, I'm sure that's a tough balance to walk.
I'm curious about, you hear a lot of people saying the AI is getting worse. It used to be amazing and it's no longer good. And I know OpenAI has like evals where you can programmatically test if it actually is getting worse, or are you just being spoiled that this robot in the sky is doing all the answers for you? Is there any way? It's kind of a two-part question. Is first, like, how do you guys check that it's not getting worse over time? And second, why do some things get worse? Is it because they're putting less compute into it? Are they turning the knob down so it's a little cheaper?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer the first part, how do we actually measure the success of the product? There are the more traditional ways. There's things like human eval, more traditional evaluation pipelines that are reasonably benchmarked across the industry. I mean, you'll see, I guess GPT has moved beyond this. They're now on SAT scores and whatever, LSAT. they're on their own thing. But for code, for example, like something like human eval is there are metrics that are kind of accepted. I think the tough part with human eval is that the examples don't often mimic what real life users and usage would look like. So you could think about it this way. If we went through a repo and like deleted a random line or a couple characters from a repo and then ran its unit tests again, like would they still pass? That's like a very simple metric that you can use to kind of determine how well is our model doing it, like predicting what should be filled in. That doesn't always necessarily correlate to like a better product experience for someone who is literally like typing in their IDE trying to code that function block, because they're not starting from a place where you're like masking the function, and it's a very different pattern. And so our metrics, and we've honed in on, I think, one that we're happy with. We're going with characters per opportunity. And let me break down what that exactly means.
Yeah.
So characters per opportunity means how many characters of code are we generating given an opportunity defined as basically a keystroke. Like our latency is low enough such that every keystroke, we are trying our best to give you some sort of completion. The reason why we chose this metric as opposed to something like acceptance rate you could basically imagine as how often are we showing you something that you then press tab and accept. That's a fine metric, but I think it hides you from the ultimate end goal of trying to write the most amount of code, useful code for a developer. Because you could show 10% of the number of completions, but have very, very high confidence that you're going to accept something. But that's not actually as useful. And so we've decided to go with this notion of characters per opportunity to say, on any given keystroke, what's the average number of tokens that we generate that they end up accepting and end up in their checked in production code base. And so this is the metric that we use internally to track, okay, we push out a new model or we run a new experiment flag. Did it actually move the needle in terms of value provided to the developer?
Wow. I got to say, even after using this for, just a little bit while we've been talking, because I've had it installed before, but it's shocking how, just straight up how fast it is. And I can't get my database queries to be this fast. It is like, it's so shockingly fast. And that's all just due to how you're handling the compute, as we've talked about so far.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things here. It comes down to just efficiency of GPUs, the inference. That's what the inference service is. Mm-hmm. It also comes down to that cancellation stuff we're talking about. I mean, obviously there's compression and making sure that the prompt to model path is as short as possible in our code. We write very distributed code. So our language server is actually written in Go. And so we have a lot of different Go routines kicking off, things that are computed in parallel to try and essentially like improve that latency North Star metric.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, like, what are you writing this in? Because like I've been doing some embedding stuff where I decided to forego the vector database and I just do it all in memory. And like, it's like you said, it's surprisingly fast to generate the embeddings and to run the computation against all those embeddings, which it's a lot in memory to do, but I'm sure I get nowhere near 10 milliseconds for that type of stuff in JavaScript. So like what other languages are you using to make that fast?
We've got some brilliant people here who know C++ inside and out, and
okay,
that's a lot of the inference service is written in that, and I think that and distributed systems code has been the most important.
That's cool.
And another thing to note, and another way that kind of Codeium was architected a bit differently, that language server paradigm is, I believe, unique to the way that we constructed our service. We've gone with very light extension and very heavy language server. So in a way, you can kind of think it as a front end, back end sort of split. I guess in this case, it's kind of like a middleware sort of situation. But if you write everything in Go, the Go code is actually quite fast. And I think, you can get into the whole JavaScript performance stuff, but VS Code is a JavaScript extension. And so inherently, you're going to kind of run into some sort of bottlenecks with either the performance that VS Code is going to allow you to run at, or any sort of extension surface, whether that be like a Vim script or writing the extension in Kotlin for JetBrains, for example. You might run into bottlenecks there. And so we try to de-risk that as much as possible, decouple those two things so that the very rigorous compute happens in this sort of efficient binary that we have high confidence in will run quickly.
Wow.
Yeah. I bet the VS Code render is longer than the entire compute of what you're going to write.
It's shocking. It's like blowing my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess whoever's listening at home, we actually have a playground on our website. You'll be able to go to codeium.com. So it's codeium.com. We have a playground button, and that'll actually, without any installation, you can just use autocomplete in your browser, and you can kind of see how quickly, things get going. One also interesting thing to note, caching is something that has helped a lot as well from a technical perspective. That basically just means when we get completions, we do sort of store them locally for a time being, and we have this heuristic that determines how relevant they are. So even if it's not necessarily, you generate a completion, you don't like it, you type something different, and we throw it away. It's not quite like that. We can actually break that completion down into pieces that might be usable in the future if you were to encounter kind of a similar prompt. So in that way, we have like a multi-level, like we have this sort of local retrieval that we can go to in addition to generating full new completions.
Wow.
And are you using like TCP sockets or WebSockets, or like what's the actual pipe between Codeium and my editor?
Yeah. So we use our RPCs. So
okay,
I remember you did a podcast on that, but we're using RPCs because this is a web developer oriented podcast. There's actually an interesting part of the product that I kind of want to highlight.
Yeah.
So again, we've kind of covered the architecture between extension and language server, but we actually have a different surface, which is the chat surface. So if you open up that chat tab, you'll actually see, the ability to talk to an assistant, it's context aware, all those sorts of features. That is actually a React TypeScript. Think of it as like a web view. So what we've done is built a client that is, again, independent from the IDE that you're using.
Wow. Yeah.
And we bundle that into, just a minified bundle, right? And we serve that so that it can be iframeable on different extensions. And so this means that when we build something for VS Code, that code automatically gets shipped over to JetBrains, and JetBrains is running a similar setup where it's actually just the same source code being kind of rendered in a local iframe, like a local chat client. Think of it as just running yarn dev, right?
That makes so much sense.
Yeah. In this way, we're able to ship to all these different IDEs like Vim and Visual Studio and all these different platforms that either might use languages that we're not familiar with or things that, it allows us to scale a lot better. And then another interesting thing about the communication between all these things, and again, this requires a bit of a headache for implementation, but it's paid dividends over the long run, is we built a WebSocket system to allow for push and pull communication from all these different surfaces. So originally, if you have your IDE, you have your language server, and you have your chat view, these things all need to be able to both notify and receive notifications across all these different threads. An example being, we have buttons on top of functions, so certain parts of the AST tree, where you can generate, for example, like generate a docstring. When you actually click that button that says generate docstring, it's pushing to the language server, generating said docstring, simultaneously pushing those updates to the chat client. And then once the chat client receives it, renders the message, the user presses insert and apply. It pushes that back to the language server, which then can push back to the IDE because we need this multi-way, bi-directional communication in order to make this experience like interactive. And I think that's when you get into, we've done all sorts of tricks with web developer, web app communication that makes this quite an interesting product to work on.
Wow.
Wow.
There's some cool problems to be solving.
Hard, yeah.
There's a closed beta for GPT-4. Is that just using OpenAI's model then, or how does that work?
Yeah, so this brings up an interesting point that we are, I guess we sometimes use the term like sovereign internally. We are not tied to either a particular model, a particular IDE, cough, cough, like Microsoft. We're not tied to a particular SCM, cough, cough, GitHub. And so as a result, we want to deliver the best experience possible to our customers. And so if GPT-4 is the best reasoning model on the market, we want to be able to provide that experience for you. We never want you to feel this sort of, like competing interests. They're only going to use their own model. We firmly believe that our model is quite solid. However, we also do want to see what individuals feel, how the difference is between GPT-4 and our internal model and where maybe the gaps are that we can close. And so we feel comfortable pushing out these sorts of changes. So for the example that you're seeing, GPT-4, if you fill out the waitlist form, and I can get you off the waitlist form, your a certain percentage of your traffic, or I guess dependent on the way you set it up, there's a drop down that lets you select the different model, but it'll route traffic to that appropriate model, and then we'll be able to see based on your usage, anonymized usage of the product, is GPT-4 good at generating doc strings better than ours? Or is it better at generating unit tests? Are they better at answering questions? It allows us to see where, we might improve.
I like it. I love that approach to things. Like we often say that about the podcast in general, is that like we're not romantic about it being a podcast. Like it can be whatever medium. We want people to learn to code in the best way possible, and whatever medium we need to take, that's the way we're gonna go.
Yeah. And I think that from a developer standpoint, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I don't want to feel trapped in a particular setup. I don't want to feel trapped in a particular like pricing plan or whatever it may be. And so we come from a similar cut where we're like, okay, we want this to be a free product. We want everyone to try and use this thing. And again, we're not going to screw you if you're not hosting your code on GitHub, right? If you're using Bitbucket, we'll happily index your code from Bitbucket and just trying to meet you where you are, meet everyone with whatever tools they're currently using.
Yeah. And if you're out there, you're wondering, is the free product good? You have to pay for Copilot, whatever. Yeah, it's fantastic. So don't let the fact that it's free make you think that it's by any means less capable or something. This thing is awesome.
Yeah, it's certainly worth trying out many different ones. And even actually, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but for a full year, I maintained an issue on the Copilot discussion board about this like closing quote bug.
Oh my gosh,
where it would add additional closing quotes, and I was just like, it was so frustrating. And they fixed it last week after saying they had fixed it 3 times. But Codeium doesn't have that issue. Are you aware of what that issue is and how to fix it?
Yeah. So Wes, I've been commenting on your thread on Twitter. I was the one posting the Codeium GIF for this because this is a funny point, and I think this comes back to like we are the biggest users of our own product. Like we as developers, we hated that frustration point, right? You're like console logging something and you already have your quotes because of IntelliSense, but then all of a sudden you end up with like another quote and another parenthesis and another semicolon. It's like crazy. And so it was a lot of work to introduce this concept called inline FIM, which fill in the middle is what FIM stands for. And what this does is it not only does rule-based resolutions of those sorts of scenarios, right? Because you can imagine writing a one-off for like, if there's a quote at the end, but there's a quote at the end of this. Like
that's what they did. They're like, we fixed it, and they just covered like 3 or 4 common use cases, but it's not good enough.
It's not good enough. And so we went out and because we own our own model, we were able to produce another iteration of that model that had FIM examples built in. So we would do exactly those sorts of scenarios in our training data to then make it so that when you were typing in the middle of a function, it would know what's above and what's below or left and right, so that when you're writing an argument, for example, in a function, it's not going to try and generate the rest of the function. It's going to know that the function already exists and you're just adding another argument. And so it's like those little things that we get really hung up on, right?
Yeah.
We really want to use our product and we want it to be great and we want to accelerate our own development. And so we're very meticulous about these sorts of pain
points.
That's
impressive, because I went like there's sometimes bugs just bug me, and that was one of them. And I went on a tour, and Sourcegraph Cody had it, Google's whatever they called it, and probably will rename it by the time this comes out. Copilot obviously had it, and Code Whisperer from Amazon had it. And I was like, this must be a showstopper in the AI world. We can write the code, but no one can figure out how to stop
AI code.
Yeah.
The Achilles heel.
Cool. I'm so glad we finally, because I was always just like, I understand that it's an issue, but like someone explain to me what is the issue here.
Yeah. And it comes down to like I'm sort of organizational and architectural setups that allow you to make those changes. So you can imagine if your research team or your model development team is very far away from your product team, these problems are non-trivial, right? You've got to coordinate, you've got to somehow assemble a data set that mimics this, you've got to get that user feedback over to the model team. Like that latency of communication is very difficult. And when you're a small company like Codeium is, and you're sitting next to the person who's training the model, these sorts of things can move a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Wow. Cool. Well, I think we're getting close to the end here, so we should probably move into Supper Club questions. But I think we can, I think these are typically questions we ask everybody. But I think I think we've been kind of going off script there a little bit lately. And I had a question for you as a user of AI tools, an everyday user. What tools are you getting the most value of?
I'm a freelance photographer. I do a lot of events, engagements, drone photography, the whole thing. And I guess a very simple one is like Google Photos has been an incredible tool for me to organize and manage, I guess, my photography inventory. Being able to, I guess, the AI component of this, like I love the object detection and being able to say like, I want a picture of my sister just played a basketball game yesterday. I want a picture of my sister dribbling a basketball. Like being able to filter like the million photos down into just a few is fantastic. So I'd say like Google Photos is definitely up there.
I have like kind of a rare breed of dog, and she has dreadlocks, and she's an odd dog. But I can search in my Google Photos for photos of her by name, and it will find from when she was shaved and looked like a poodle. I don't know how it connects those two dogs together. They don't look anything alike. Somehow it manages to do that.
That might be some Google, knows everything about your life sort of
exactly.
Sort of
yeah.
I use it like crazy for just like parts of stuff. So like fixing the snowblower last week, I just snap a photo of the spark plug. And then yesterday I was at the auto parts store and I just bring up Google Photos, type spark plug in, and boom, right there I have the number. I don't need to remember the number or write it down or anything.
I mean, there's plenty of interesting stuff out there.
Yeah. Have you dove into have you used like Perplexity at all? We just talked about this in the last episode, and it's one of my favorite new tools.
Yeah. Perplexity is we've talked about it a lot internally because I think they're similar space, and like search is definitely one of the frontiers that we're trying to be a leader in. Perplexity is a great product. I mean, it seems like usage and adoption, perhaps it's just the echo chambers of Twitter or whatever communities I'm a part of that are using it, but it does seem like people are getting a lot of value out of it. And I think it kind of comes down to a lot of like user experience things that they do and the way that you sort of package a complex product like that. I can't say I'm a power user yet, perhaps in the future, but I've heard good things.
Yeah. I'm not using it as a coding tool more than as I am. Hey, what's that thing on Twitter?
Speaking of coding tools, what editor are you using?
Well, I use VS Code with Vim bindings.
Ooh.
And yes, I'm trying to think. I use Light Theme. I am a light.
Okay.
All right. Cancel the podcast. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yep. In my defense, I did use Vim throughout college, and I felt very, very slick, sitting in the dining hall and doing
I bet.
I had a coworker that would write his like papers in Vim, like his class papers, and I'm just like, there's no need to do that. You don't got to do that. I get it.
I'm sure they looked very cool.
Yeah.
What do the people that build self-driving cars use? Are they Vim users?
Ooh, so, okay, I guess.
I would hope so.
A lot of Vim users.
Okay.
A lot of hardcore Vim users. One thing that people were kind of forced to use VS Code because of, at least at Neuro, we had a lot of SSHing and like dev container setups. And so, it kind of forces people's hands to switch over to the easiest thing for IT to set up. But we did have our fair share of lived in Vim, live in Emacs.
Cool.
What editors do you two use?
VS Code now. I've been on it for a while now. It feels weird to say that because I did resist for a little bit and I stayed on Sublime Text for a long time.
I was there, yeah.
Yeah, but no, I've been on VS Code since like 2015 or something, and I've been there a long time at this point.
Yeah, same. I think the next big step is you run it in a container instead of locally. We're starting to see a lot of companies say, like Shopify, all their devs run it on like a remote instance of VS Code, and they just type it into the browser, and it's their whole environment.
I mean, yeah, if it works.
It seems crazy, but like it's just a browser locally. But like when it's in the actual browser, it seems weird,
It feels weird. I mean, I'm a desktop Figma guy. I will say I'm not like a browser Figma, and so maybe that's just.
The way
I'm
no, you
conditioned.
can't do that in the browser. It's not as good. even though it's probably the same thing.
Probably literally the same.
Yeah, probably. Yes,
It
exactly.
actually is the same thing. Yeah. Actually,
yeah.
that's an interview I've been trying to get on the podcast for a long time, is Evan from Figma.
That would be
And,
sweet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If anybody, although like a couple times we've just like casually mentioned guests we wanted on. What was the one that I mentioned the other day? I wanted to get the guy on from Cards Against Humanity. And he's like, "Oh, that's my brother." The guy's brother is listening to the podcast. So
that's wild.
I'm just putting it out there. If anyone's got an intro to Evan from Figma, let us know.
I have intros to other people from Figma, so I can maybe weasel my way in there.
That'd be cool.
Cool. Well, that's pretty much it. Kevin, now is the opportunity for you to give, we've been given kind of a shameless plug this whole time, but we'll give you one more chance to do a shameless plug, but also a sick pick, which is anything that you're just enjoying in life right now. Could be anything. Wes literally picked a rice cooker in the last episode, and I forget what I picked. I picked Perplexity, I think.
So I think pick-wise, I've been using an app called Laps a lot more recently. Laps is a social media app. It's kind of a mix between Be Real. From what I understand, I was never a Be Real user, but a mix between Be Real and like Snapchat. The reason why I've been, I guess, pleasantly surprised by the experience is it's one of these things where you like take a picture and you can't see it for like X number of minutes or hours. And it applies like a really nice film-esque filter. And then there's a bit of like social aspect to it. But honestly, just the experience of like unwrapping a photo that doesn't look anything like what you took originally is very satisfying. I think this comes back to like, I am a, professional photographer that like really cares about pixels and like, using the biggest resolution and like the best editing quality. And like, it's been really liberating using this Laps app to basically like capture random moments in my life and then have essentially like a crummy version from a technical perspective, like a crummy version of the photo kind of lying around. So I would say that has been a fun social media thing it's not very often that I pick up a new social media app, but that's been kind of fun.
Cool. Yeah, I'll take a look. I've never seen this. Yeah.
And then the shameless plug, shameless plug is if you haven't used an AI developer tool or are using a competitor, you should consider switching over to Codeium, which is the best in-class AI assistant. It does autocomplete and chat and is aware of your files and is the most personalized product out there for developers. It will give you, a 2x, 3x boost on your productivity. And it honestly just feels like magic. And best of all, it is, of course, free for individuals. No catches, no weird fine print. It's free. We don't train on your data. Your code is yours. Give it a shot. Codeium.com. I'm sure it'll be in the podcast description. Try it out. Let me know.
Totally.
Let me know what you
Will
think.
it make you a
Twitter.
10x developer?
I think
I heard some
it will
X's
make
in
you,
there.
Yeah, a lot of
Okay.
X's. A lot of X's.
Cool.
You might be, Chad level status achieved.
Sick. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. This has been a blast. It was really great getting to talk to you. I think, a lot of stuff blew my mind in this one. So
Yeah,
I
that was
hope
good.
everybody out there liked it. So thanks so much, Kevin. And glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right. See you later. Peace.
See ya.
Peace.